And welcome to those who now came to join us. I would like to introduce Father Dr. Destivelle. He is the next speaker, Director of the Institute for Ecumenical Studies at the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas Angelicum in Rome, and official at the Oriental section of the Dicastery for Promoting Christian Unity at the Vatican. He was director of the Parisian Scientific and Ecclesial Center Istina from 2005 to 2010, specializing in Orthodox Catholic dialogue, and editor-in-chief of the magazine Vérité. He teaches ecclesiology at the Faculty of Theology of the Institut Catholique de Paris and is a member of the Theological Committee Catholic Orthodox de France, as well as the International Academy of Religious Sciences. He was Dean of the Northwest region of the Archdiocese of the Mother of God in Moscow from 2010 to 13, and rector of St. Catherine's Church in St. Petersburg. Since 2013, he has been official of the Dicastery for the Promotion of Christian Unity, and in 2023, he was appointed expert participant at the Synod of Bishops for a Synodal Church held at the Vatican until this October. Thank you that you came for presenting a topic. It's a document where maybe, if I'm not wrong, you might be even called the ghost writer of the Bishop of Rome. And thank you very much for coming to Vienna.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. It's a joy to be with you, and I would like to speak about this document. It's the Bishop of Rome, and especially on the question of a differentiated primacy. In a few days, on 21st November, the Catholic Church will celebrate the 60th anniversary of the decree Unitatis Redintegratio, which marks the official entry of the Catholic Church into the ecumenical movement. Unitatis Redintegratio does not explicitly mention the question of primacy. However, it's number 2, dedicated to the principles of unity, after mentioning the interior principles of unity that are Christ and the Holy Spirit, evokes the structural principles of unity, namely the College of the 12, from among whom Christ chose Peter, then the College of Bishops, and the successor of Peter, the Bishop of Rome. Interestingly, when Peter and his successors are mentioned, the decree Unitatis Redintegratio specifies that it is Christ himself who is the supreme cornerstone, and that it's Christ himself who, in the Holy Spirit, accomplishes communion in unity. The ecumenical reflection since Vatican II concerning the Petrine ministry can be considered as a development of these principles laid down by Unitatis Redintegratio. In the following considerations, mainly based on the recently published document, The Bishop of Rome, but trying to express its main ideas perhaps in a different way, I would like to show how the ecumenical reflection regarding primacy has made it possible to overcome some false oppositions. And in a second step, I will try to propose some perspectives for a model of differentiated primacy. So first part, overcoming oppositions. False ecclesiological dichotomies or oppositions have been relativized thanks to ecumenical dialogue since Vatican II. I would like to mention 5 of them. Between primacy and synodality, between de jure divino and de jure humano, between local church and universal church, between the first and second millennium, and between the primacy of honor and primacy of jurisdiction. A first dichotomy concerns the relationship between primacy and synodality. This pairing has been the basis of ecumenical ecclesiological reflection over the last 40, perhaps even 50 years. This reflection has emphasized the mutual interdependence of primacy and synodality at all levels of the Church, local, regional, and universal. The main advantage of such an approach was to show the necessity of primacy at universal level, but also of synodality at the same universal level. In Catholic Orthodox dialogue, this reflection is largely based on the model of the Apostolic Canon 34, describing the relationship between the metropolitan and the suffragan bishops in a region. This principle was expressed with particular emphasis by the Ravenna document of 2007, and then repeated by the documents of Chieti in 2016 and of Alexandria in 2023 last year. In reality, this principle had been formulated much earlier, already by the Anglican Catholic Dialogue, ARCIC, which noted already in 1976, so 31 years before Ravenna, the need for a fair balance between primacy and conciliarity, two complementary aspects of episcopacy, as it was said by the Catholic Anglican Commission. However, this dichotomous approach has two important weaknesses. The first is that primacy and synodality are understood as two competing principles to be kept in balance, with synodality being understood as a counterweight to primacy, and vice versa. Such a presentation risks leading to paralysis or to a pendulum effect, depending on the time and circumstances. This is the first problem with this approach. The second difficulty is a lack of coherence in the definition of synodality, while the documents, and notably the documents of the Catholic Orthodox Dialogue, adopt a very broad definition of synodality based on baptism. We can even say that it is the understanding of the Sabornos, which was mentioned by Monsignor Ivan Datsko. So this very broad definition is based on baptism, but the documents illustrate this synodality essentially on the basis of episcopal collegiality, namely on Apostolic Canon 34, which concerns relations between bishops. So there is a kind of inconsistency in these documents, defining synodality on the basis of baptism, but illustrating the same synodality with episcopal collegiality. The primacy-synodality dichotomy does not sufficiently distinguish, in my mind, the collegial dimension from the communal or communitarian dimension. That is to say, the specific mission of the bishops on the one hand, and on the other hand, the contribution of the sensus fidei of all members of the people of God. This is why, instead of dialectically conceiving the primacy-synodality relationship as a pair to be kept in balance, it is much more fruitful from an ecclesiological point of view and more promising from an ecumenical methodology to understand synodality in a broader way as a dynamic articulation of the three dimensions: communal, collegial, and primatial. And it is exactly what is done in the document, The Bishop of Rome. In this approach, primacy belongs to the synodal dynamic. And I insist, primacy belongs to synodality. The final document of the 16th General Assembly of the Synod of Bishops, recently published, took up this presentation of synodality in its triple dimension, specifically with regard to the Bishop of Rome. I quote, "Synodality symphonically articulates the communal, collegial, and personal, communal whole, collegial sum, and personal one, dimensions of the individual churches and all of the whole church. In this perspective, and I continue the quote, in this perspective, the Petrine ministry is inherent in the synodal dynamic, as are the communal aspect, which includes the entire people of God, and the collegial dimension of the episcopal ministry. So in this presentation, we see that we are no more in this dialectical opposition between primacy and synodality, but that primacy belongs to the synodal dynamic, including the whole, sum, and one. This is the first opposition overcome thanks to an ecumenical reflection. A second false opposition concerns the relationship between the de jure divino and de jure humano. While Catholic theology traditionally understands the primacy of the Bishop of Rome as being established de jure divino, most other Christians understand the primacy as being instituted on simply de jure humano. The Eastern churches generally emphasize the political foundation of the Roman primacy, the Eastern Orthodox churches, of primacy, relying on Canon 28 of the Council of Chalcedon, which recognized the prerogative, presbyteria, of the seat of the ancient Rome on the basis of its imperial status. Hermeneutical clarifications have made it possible to relativize this traditional dichotomy between de jure divino and de jure humano, insisting instead on the distinction between the theological content of primacy and the historical contingencies in which it manifests itself, that is, between the doctrinal essence and the contingent historical form of primacy. For example, the second in Utunum Sint already distinguished the essential of the mission of the Bishop of Rome and the way of exercising primacy, a way that must be open to a new situation, as said John Paul II. But if it is interesting to emphasize the human and contingent dimension of primacy, it is equally interesting to reflect on the divine dimension of synodality, and more generally to reconsider the theological weight of factors sometimes considered purely institutional in the life of the Church. The Church being both divine and human, its institutions and canons do not only have an organizational or disciplinary value, but are the expression of the life of the Church under the guidance of the Holy Spirit. And among these institutions, synodality is, of course, part of its very nature. Like primacy, synodality is inherent in the essence of the Church and is therefore also de jure divino. Synodality is also de jure divino, as Metropolitan John Zizioulas has often emphasized. Thus, if the human dimension of primacy is better understood, the divine dimension of synodality is also better recognized. In both cases, it is a matter of better distinguishing the theological essence from historical contingencies. A third false opposition concerns the relationship between local and universal churches. Traditionally, while most Christian traditions emphasize the local realization of the Church, Catholic ecclesiology insists on the universal dimension. We are all familiar with the debate between Cardinals Kasper and Ratzinger in the early 2000 years, following the affirmation by Communionist Nuncio of the ontological and chronological priority of the universal church over the particular churches. Ecumenical dialogues have helped to better take into account the simultaneity of these two dimensions. For example, the first document of the International Orthodox Catholic Dialogue stated, since Christ is one for the many in the church, which is his body. The one and the many, the universal and the local, are necessarily simultaneous. The ecumenical dialogues has helped for a deeper understanding in the Catholic magisterium of the intrinsic correlation or even ecclesiological perichoresis, as it is said in the document of the International Theological Commission, between the local church and the universal church or the whole church. Above all, many ecclesiological dialogues have stressed that in most Christian communions, it is not the local or universal level that is most relevant for the exercise of primacy, but it is the regional level. It is therefore necessary to articulate primacy in the whole church to the primacies in the churches at the regional or supra-local level. Vatican II, by the way, has also recognized that this regional dimension is rooted in the divine will, affirming that, I quote, divine providence has willed that the various churches established in various places by the apostles and their successors come together in the course of time in several groups organically united. A fourth false opposition concerns the first and second millennia. Certainly, according to the well-known axiom of Cardinal Ratzinger, as he said, as regard to the doctrine of primacy, Rome must not demand from the East more than what was formulated and lived during the first millennium. However, as the Centurinus group notes, in Orthodox Catholic dialogue, there is a strong tendency to idealize the first millennium, and one cannot really speak of an undivided church in the first millennium. This affirmation relies on an observation by Yves Congar, who noted that between the 4th and the 9th centuries, the time of the ecumenical councils, no less than 200 years of schism separated Rome and Constantinople, not to mention the tragic divisions of the 5th century, following the councils of Ephesus and Chalcedon. The usual contrast between the first and second millennia for East-West ecclesial relations is therefore too simplistic. The reunited church cannot rest on the re-establishment of ancient institutions of the first millennium without taking into account the developments of the second millennium. And finally, even taking into account the two first millennia, the churches on their path to full communion should first and foremost respond to the challenges of the third millennium. Let us end with a final false opposition between primacy of honor and primacy of jurisdiction. We can say that there is an ecumenical consensus to recognize the primacy of honor of the Bishop of Rome. However, several dialogues emphasize that in the first millennium, primacy of honor did not simply mean honorary precedence, but the authority to make real decisions, as noted by the North American Catholic Orthodox Dialogue. While the French Catholic Orthodox Dialogue calls for moving beyond this opposition, holding that, I quote, honor implies real responsibility and authority. If the primate is indeed inter pares, it is nonetheless truly primus. Generally speaking, it is necessary to avoid a superficial and unrealistic opposition between jurisdiction and communion. In this first part of my paper, but I will be shorter in my second part, I have tried to show how ecumenical dialogue has helped to overcome and relativize a certain number of false opposition between primacy and synodality, between the iure divino and the iure humano, between the local church and the universal church, between the first and second millennium, and finally, between primacy of honor and the primacy of jurisdiction. And I would like now to propose some perspectives for a primacy that is above all a ministry of unity. A first perspective would be to, as it has already been mentioned, to reformulate the Catholic doctrine of primacy. namely to reformulate the dogmas of Vatican I. The First Vatican Council promoted the personal dimension by defining the dogmas of the primacy of jurisdiction and papal infallibility, doctrines that the Second Vatican Council completed by valorizing the episcopal collegiality. In a new development, the current pontificate of Pope Francis deepens the communal dimension of the Church based on the sensus fidei of all the faithful by virtue of their baptism. But there is an urgent need for a re-reception or even a reformulation of the teachings of Vatican I by the Catholic Church within this synodal framework. As many ecumenical dialogues note, these teachings of Vatican I have been profoundly conditioned by their historical context. The recent document of the Catholic Orthodox dialogue in Alexandria notes, for example, that Vatican II integrated and completed the teaching of Vatican I, but did not interpret Vatican I. It is therefore particularly necessary to clarify the terminology adopted by Vatican I, which often remains ambiguous and subject to erroneous interpretations. For example, ordinary, immediate, and universal jurisdiction, supreme power, etc. In this way, primacy will regain its full place in the triple communal, collegial, and personal articulation of synodality. A second suggestion made by several ecumenical dialogues is to distinguish more clearly between the different responsibilities of the Pope, in particular between his patriarchal ministry in the Western Church and his primatial ministry of unity in the communion of churches. As early in 1969, Professor Ratzinger questioned a uniform vision of primacy by reflecting on the patriarchal function of the Bishop of Rome. I quote, "Unitarian ecclesial law, Unitarian liturgy, Unitarian attribution of episcopal sees made by the Roman Center, all these are things which are not necessarily part of primacy as such," said Professor Ratzinger, and may seem to be the case, as it may seem to be the case when the two ministries of the Pope and the Patriarch become united. It will therefore be necessary in the future to distinguish more clearly the effective function of the successor of Peter from the patriarchal function, and, if necessary, to create new patriarchates detached from the Latin Church. End of quote. The French Orthodox Catholic dialogue has called since 1991 for a differentiated exercise of the jurisdiction of the Bishop of Rome, according to whether it concerns the Western churches or the Universal Church. Similarly, the International Orthodox Catholic Dialogue observes in the latest document in Alexandria that there is a desire to distinguish what one might call the patriarchal ministry of the Pope within the Western or Latin Church from his primatial service to the communion of all the churches, which offers new possibilities for the future. As mentioned, the reinstatement in the Annuario Pontificio of the title Patriarch of the West among the historical titles of the Pope could be an opportunity to reflect on this distinction. And it is also necessary to distinguish the patriarchal and primatial roles of the Bishop of Rome from his political function as head of state. Finally, since the various responsibilities of the Pope are based on his ministry as Bishop of Rome, it is important to emphasize more his episcopal ministry at the local level. And the fact that all recent papal documents are signed from St. John the Lateran, so the Cathedral of the Bishop of Rome, is undoubtedly one of the significant ecclesiological symbols of this pontificate. A third recommendation made by the theological dialogues concerns the development of synodality within the Catholic Church. In this internal synodality, an important aspect is the enhancement of the regional dimension. The final document of the Synod on Synodality, adopted 2 weeks ago, affirms that in the synodal process, the continental ecclesial assemblies constitute a legacy to be valued as an effective means of implementing the teaching of the Second Vatican Council. I quote, "Their theological and canonical status of these continental assemblies, as well as that of the continental groupings of episcopal conferences, will have to be clarified in order to be able to exploit their potential for the further development of a synodal church." End of quote. In accordance with the parallel established by Lumen Gentium 1023 between episcopal conferences and patriarchates, Joseph Ratzinger wondered 50 years ago, I quote, "if the churches of Asia and Africa, like those of the East, could not become the equivalent of patriarchates under this name or another name that one wishes to give to these churches in the future." The Ravenna document also takes up the parallel of Lumen Gentium 23 between patriarchate and episcopal conferences. The North American Orthodox Catholic dialogue with respect to the Eastern churches proposed that in a reconciled church, the relationship of the Bishop of Rome with the Eastern churches and their bishops should be substantially different from the relationship currently accepted in the Latin Church, and added that the present-day Eastern Catholic churches would relate to the Bishop of Rome in the same way as the present-day Orthodox churches would. The fourth proposition made by ecumenical dialogues concerns what we can call ecumenical synodality, even if this expression is not entirely satisfactory, because all synodality is ecumenical. Although synodality is an internal reality within the churches, the concept can also be applied to the relationship between the churches, and especially between the Catholic Church and the other Christian communions, since the ecumenical journey is also a process of working together, the synodos. This synodality ad extra already exists. The invitation to other Christian communions to participate in Catholic synodal processes at all levels is particularly important and could be extended. For example, the participation this year of 16 fraternal delegates in the Synod of Bishops was unique. And but could be some documents, ecumenical documents, suggested that this synodality ad extra could be extended to ad limina visits. For example, the North American Orthodox Catholic consultation. Recent initiatives illustrate also this way of promoting external synodality, such as the 2018 meeting in Bari of church leaders gathered at the invitation of Pope Francis to pray, reflect, and exchange informally on the situation of Christians in the Middle East. It is already an ecumenical synodality. And the final document of the Synod on Synodality invites also to imagine, I quote, ecumenical synodal practices, including forms of consultation and discernment on urgent issues of common interest, such as the celebration of an ecumenical synod on evangelization, and to put into practice forms of synodality among Christians of all traditions. The last proposal concerns the search for a model of communion. It should be possible to propose, based on the above-mentioned principles, a model of communion based on a service of love recognized by all concerned, as said John Paul II. Even if there is a single service of love, such a model of communion should be realized differently in the East and in the West, and even differently within the Christian East and differently within the Christian West. Primacy could be exercised differently in the Latin Church, with the Eastern Catholic churches, with the Orthodox churches, with the Western Christian communions. As for the Orthodox churches, which the Catholic Church recognized a common ecclesial structure based on apostolic tradition and the sacraments, this model could be inspired by the often cited principle that Rome must not demand from the East more than what was formulated and lived in the first millennium. It is clear that the Orthodox churches do not recognize the current relations of the Eastern Catholic churches with Rome as a model of communion acceptable to them. Perhaps this model should imply the recognition of the right of the Eastern churches to govern themselves according to their own disciplines, as it was already recognized by Unitatis Redintegratio number 16. This model could also include two responsibilities identified by the dialogue relating to the ministry of unity of the Bishop of Rome, namely a specific role in ecumenical councils and the role of mediation in the event of conflicts of a disciplinary or doctrinal nature through the synodal exercise of the procedure of appeal as described by the Council of Sardica. Conclusion. In the first part, I have tried to show how ecumenical dialogue has helped to overcome and relativize a certain number of false oppositions. And in the second part, I have tried to propose some perspectives for a primacy that is above all a ministry of unity. But the last proposal is certainly the most important, namely to propose a new model of full communion. It is indeed important to have a perspective and a direction for the common journey. If the churches, thanks to the historical work now, know better where they come from and where their divisions come from, the objective of the ecumenical movement seems less and less clear. Indeed, as states the famous saying of Seneca, there is no favorable wind for the sailor who doesn't know where to go. The Seneca famous saying seems more than ever to apply to ecumenical movement. Restoring a vision for unity will help restore the desire for unity. And it is undoubtedly the vocation of Eastern Catholic canon lawyers and theologians to propose, together of course, the concrete modalities of a new model of communion so that the world may believe. Thank you.